So I kind of wanted to continue our conversation from yesterday, and I kind of like where these conversations are headed because we talk about a lot of stuff during the week, and oftentimes those conversations like spark more thoughts, and those thoughts kind of marinate for a while. And Sunday is usually a good time where the thoughts are have properly marinated, because there's usually like a 1 or 2 day incubation period there. And so I was thinking about this concept of like exercise working and talking about an exercise blowing up my biceps, or I switched to this new variation, and then all of a sudden it was like 2 weeks later I started to notice my delts popping. You hear people say all those kinds of things, and to me that kind of a conversation and framing, which is very I'll say it's encouraged in terms of like a messaging strategy on social media. Like, it's encouraged for people to write these short sort of polarizing quips of like, do this one thing, to explode this muscle, or do this, use this one simple trick, right? It's that old like, what is it? That porn message of like, you won't believe what this pill does in this 7 day period, like 7 inches in 7 days or something like that. Like, that's kind of what it reminds me of. But anyway, it got me thinking, and I think a good analogy for it is kind of like, you look at muscle growth as like, a really nicely cooked meal. Maybe there's like 20 or so, just picking an arbitrary number, 20 or so ingredients that you put into that meal. And picking any individual ingredient and talking about it outside the context of the others kind of seems to me to be to be missing the point in some ways, where you could pick one of the ingredients out and be like, oh, it's the salt that makes this whole thing taste super good, or oh, it's the cheese, or oh, it's the meat. It's like, no, it's obviously the combination of all of these things that allows you or anyone to sort of push the needle forward or in the direction that you want. So this framework of like looking at a single exercise in such a narrow, close up sort of a viewpoint, I have definitely moved away from over time. The more that we do this, the less confident I become in any single thing moving the needle, and to any significant degree. So to start off, that was just kind of context for the listener. Obviously, you heard a lot of that, yesterday or whenever we talked about it. But I kind of wanted you to reiterate some of your perspectives that you had mentioned to me just about this in general, specifically as it relates to like, exercise selection for you over time, and, specifically over the course of the last, year or two, just how refined that's become in terms of like the things that you do and that you don't do in the gym. Because like, and just that as a general discussion topic to me is interesting, because even though things are so refined, you still are able to keep that like 30,000 foot view of what's really important. Like, we're not as hyper specific, if you want to call it that, with our training, I think, as we used to be with defining specific division, and we just have become more broad with it. So I think that perspective and that storyline for people would kind of be interesting to hear more about, and just in your training specifically, and sort of what kind of a role that or really what kind of a mental space you have come from and moved toward with any sort of single variable thing, like an exercise, like a specific rep range, those kinds of things, if that makes sense. I know it's very broad, but kind of intentionally framed that way to for you.
I think I've given the analogy on this podcast before about looking at a restaurant menu, like specifically if you go to like Cheesecake Factory or like a New Jersey diner or something, and you have basically an encyclopedia, for a menu. So, it's like a dozen pages long.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes in that case, I'll just start by deciding what I don't want and eliminating things.
Yeah.
And that tends to narrow down the menu a lot faster. And I think just makes decision making easier when you can create more and more constraints. Um, so I think I do a similar thing from a programming standpoint. Oftentimes when I get questions, especially from people who are relatively novice, but highly motivated, or someone that like really values education, they want to know, what do I do in this specific scenario? If A, then B, or like, what is the best way to go about something? And, as you alluded to, the answers, always very nuanced and very case specific. And, we're almost using, we're using a little bit of science and a little bit of art and just experience on, putting all these factors together and, weighing sort of the cost and benefit and deciding, what the most likely, choice is to give you the best sort of risk to reward, cost to benefit there. So, when it comes to, is something working, is something not working, a lot of times the way I go about that is more by identifying, what's broken and trying to eliminate those pieces. And then out of that, oftentimes comes, the result you're looking for, rather than just thinking like, through every single piece, what's the most optimal thing in isolation. You basically get this, result. You have this kind of like almost, we'll say like chemistry solution that you're creating, and then you get this like result out of the back end. And you don't really know like what happened in the middle of it, but you can somewhat observe this result on the other end. So oftentimes it's what we're doing. We kind of put a plan in place. We have some, estimate of what might have happened, and we can talk more about that in terms of like analyzing progress and what it means if something worked versus didn't work. But most of the time when I'm, reflecting on changes to make, I'm looking for things that are breaking and trying to sort of like, buttress those spots so that they don't happen. So for example, I mentioned on the last podcast that I can definitely feel, fatigue mounting in a number of different ways. And this past week, every exercise that I did either declined or maintained performance from the previous week. So it was interesting, to note on the last podcast, I was giving you kind of some of those signs and symptoms subjectively. And, maybe that, sort of anchored me into, more, or maybe that's accurate, but, whatever the reason, this week, performance was, the next symptom that sort of cued me into, all right, we're probably coming to a close on this block. Let's, change some things up. And, one of the things I was really excited about is, I have a number of signs and symptoms that are telling me that fatigue, is present to a significant degree, to where it makes sense to sort of make some changes and, reduce that fatigue. But I didn't have any notable orthopedic symptoms this time, which is really cool. So historically, like that would have been one of those things towards the end of the block. It's like, elbows achy, back achy, something, might have come up. And there was really like a negligible amount of that, over this block, while at the same time seeing some of the more, minor things creep up, and I would say performance is, a good one. Like I don't, if I can go in this case, 13 weeks with a steady, performance increase, and at the end of it, performance kind of, plateaus or declines, irritability goes up, like, desire to train goes down, and, I start just experiencing those symptoms like I was talking about. Those are, pretty low cost in my book. And when I say like weighing, risk to reward, cost to benefit, oftentimes what you're looking at is like, I have this timeline that I've set out ahead of time. And everywhere along that timeline, I want to decide, what am I willing to give to get something back? How hard am I willing to push, and what's the cost of doing so? So if you're, 4 weeks out from a competition, you may be willing to incur a little bit more cost than you are, let's say, in the dead of off season. And then from there, you can kind of analyze like, well, what are the different components? Like, what is the fatigue that I'm accumulating, potentially on a, mental and emotional side, on a training side, on a nutritional side, on, we'll say like a sleep, in sort of a rest and recovery side. You can kind of go through one by one and, examine each of those things. So to give you an example of like what I did, coming out of this block is I know I'm going to do a 20-week diet for the New York Pro. So that's the first thing that I put on the calendar. It actually starts January 1st. You have 20 weeks. It's like kind of perfect timeline there. Probably do something like an 8-week hard push in the beginning, 4 or so weeks of maintaining that, another 4-week push, and then hopefully leaning off at that point where the final 4 weeks or so can kind of just be like eating up into the show and kind of reducing fatigue. That would be sort of an ideal 20-week prep in my mind. But again, the further you are out, the more that's kind of penciled in. And as things happen along the way, tweaks will happen. So before that, I'll have 13 more weeks. So I'm 33 weeks out now. And I know that I would still like to put on, more muscle before I start dieting, just based on, theoretically who I'd be competing against just as a professional. So I'm like, all right, in order to do that, like I'm going to need a few things in play. I'm going to need to have enough capacity from multiple angles to be able to train hard. So, mentally need to be in check, orthopedically, I need to be in check. And then, from a nutritional standpoint, like to really get the most out of it, I'll have to be, in a hypercaloric state. And then, from a drug standpoint as well, I'll have to have, enough time beforehand where I've given myself a little bit of relief from that burden, make sure health markers are in check, before pushing that back up. So now I've started with this timeline is I know I'm going to have a 20-week diet, and I know I have, 13 weeks, before that. And then from there, I can decide, all right, like, do I want to, push this training block, one more week, knowing that, performance is starting to decline, knowing that these subjective markers are starting to come up, knowing that I'm going to need, some break, of drug use. And then, from that perspective, like you just can't find a good reason, to incur more fatigue. Whereas like if I was a couple weeks out from a show, we would 100%, keep pushing. So we kind of established that timeline. And now I'm like, all right, I know that I'm going to take, some amount of time right now to kind of back things off. What do I have available to myself at this point? Like what avenues, can I move down? So again, I say like, all right, mentally, where am I at? Like, do I feel just so burned out from training that like, I just don't even want to, go into the gym? No. Okay. I can, still train. Like, did I, train so emotionally and so heavy that I really just need to back off, in regards to like load and effort? No, not really. That's still there. But, is training volume going to need to decrease a little bit? Yes. One, because I just, pointed out these fatigue markers. And then two, because as I mentioned before, there's going to need to be some reprieve, from drug use in between, which will lower, my recovery capacity. So now going into this block, I'm like, all right, how long do I want that to be? I mentioned before that I want some time, before contest prep to be able to, put on size. And then we start to have these kind of like, not, arbitrary, but again, where the art kind of comes in just based on experience of like, how long, realistically does it take to put on like an appreciable amount of muscle that's not just going to be transient. Like in terms of just like, all right, yeah, in a couple weeks, if you eat a ton of food and, take a bunch of gear, like you can put on, some fluid, but you're not really going to, hold on to any of that. You're not going to really create long-term, tissue changes doing that. So based on my experience and the people, that I've spoken to, kind of the minimum length for that is probably somewhere around 8 weeks, probably the minimum length of time that I want to come off of gear, in between cycles, or at least reduce it, is going to be at least half of the time that I was on, and sometimes, 1-to-1 with that. So if I've been on for, 12, 13 weeks, all right, we're going to take a kind of a 6-week period of, backing things off. And then that's going to leave me, with about, 7-8 weeks before we start that contest prep. So now I have, again, that kind of 13-week period where, half of that I'm going to be backing things down training wise. But then I kind of move on to the next vectors, and I'm like, nutritionally, where have I been at? I've been, at maintenance, as far as calories go for a while. And that was just based on looking at historical data and saying, all right, my body weight's been trending up for a while. If I stay on this course and just keep trending up, I'm going to run into problems. So I went, the last block I did, even though gear was in place, we kept calories at maintenance and kind of shot for a recomp. Whereas before the show, like I mentioned, I want to take some time, to actually put on body weight and give myself the potential to put on more muscle than I would if I was in an isocaloric state. So, all right, I haven't fatigued that system. My digestion's good, my willingness, to eat, my appetite, it's all there. So even though, going into this 6-week period, training's going to come down a little bit, drugs are going to come down a bit, I can still push the food that's still available to me. So it's not just this 1-to-1 of, training comes down, therefore, food has to come down as well. It's just looking at, what vectors are available. So food will come up, I'll carry that through the entire 13-week period. From a training perspective, I already train on kind of the low-ish side of sets. So when I think about reducing volume, it's not just this has to come from sets. If we just look at total training load, that could also come from something like effort, that could come, by even say messing around with rest periods, or doing supersets and finding creative ways where the actual output might come down a little bit. But you can kind of toggle other factors. So when I'll sit down with a piece of paper and just figure out what would I like this recovery period to feel like? And I think spending less time in the gym is always a good thing when you're trying to, reduce fatigue. So, I could bring it down from 5 days to 4 days, keep the total amount of sets, and then I can spend less time in the gym by, instead of doing, 3 sets to failure, I can do 1 set to failure and then just do a couple drop sets. So technically it's the same amount of training volume, but I'm only doing 1 set that kind of feels, heavy and really hard. The other 2 sets, are going to be lower loads. And, also I'll typically train the 15 to 20 rep range. So let's say, I was doing leg extensions, I was using, 375 for 15. And then, going into this block, one of the things I'll likely do is take that 15 reps, bring it down to 10 to 12, but just make it as slow and as perfect as I can possibly make it. And that's another way that I found that just kind of reduces that perception, of fatigue, allows you to kind of clean up all the exercises. And then again, I'll do the drop sets. I'll kind of cap it at roughly 35, 40% 1RM. I'll just make a rough calculation and say, all right, I'm doing this first set of, 10 to 12. I know previously that was my 15 RM if I did it first in the workout. And I'll do a little math and say all right, what would be my estimate of a 40% 1RM I'll make that like my last set. My first, set again is that kind of 15 RM that I'm doing for a real slow 10 to 12. And then I'll just make that middle drop set, right in between the two. So I like to cap it at kind of a theoretical, like lightest load that you could use and still get, a hypertrophy benefit out of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So totally
Yeah.
off topic. I just talked about whatever the fuck I talked about. This
Well,
happened
that's
to be what I was thinking about on the walk with my dog. And I said, whatever Ben brings up, I'm just going to find a way for me to think about.
well, it's great because not only is it kind of like what I want out of this, but also we can always find a way to tie it into, like if we have topic A and we have topic Z, there's bound to be at some point an overlap, at least conceptually.
Yeah.
And the overlap here to me and the overall message um of that kind of a response, just because even though like you ended up a bit tangential with where you ended up, a vast majority of that was actually exactly what I was hoping to hear, which was basically like, okay, if you're going to ask the question, you know d- does this exercise work in your program, what you have to do is you have to provide all of the context around that isolated variable, or you at least have to be aware of the context around that variable to be able to even start to discuss anything individually, right? You have to zoom out to be able to zoom in a sense. And so then the question becomes like, well, how did you know that this thing worked? And to me, in your case, in the case of bodybuilding, in any, if you're going to be able to answer that question to the best of your ability, it kind of has to be something that you're asking after the fact to some degree. And I was overhearing your conversation with your client yesterday when one of your clients was talking about just the question of like, do you think I have the potential to look XYZ? Do you think my genetics are shit? And you were just like, yeah, it's going to be really hard to tell until we actually see the outcome. So I think that the framework of just having that sort of longer timeline and that greater degree of patience in the back of your head is like, it just moves you away. Like that kind of question doesn't get asked in the first place if you have that perspective, whether it's the physique thing or whether it's the specific exercise thing. It's like, did this thing work, is a question that you can only answer after you've accumulated X amount of work, after you've accumulated X amount of weight gain, whatever it happens to be. So I think that is the much more nuanced and difficult approach to take, because you have to look at a lot more than just did the weight on this thing go up, or how do I look in the mirror. But I think that's a good thing, I think, for people to keep in mind, is that kind of question is not really an answerable question at the time of asking it, if that makes sense. Like there's a lot of things that you can kind of conceptually work through, and that is not something that you can just conceptually and intellectually muster your way through at that moment. It's kind of just, hey, we're going to use this scientific process and we're going to throw this shit at the fan. We're going to do the same thing for a while, and we're going to come back around, and however we're measuring whether or not something worked, is how we'll be able to determine that. So besides like a visual perception of like, did I get bigger? Did I get more muscular? What are the things that you specifically look for when you're asking that question of like, did this 12-week block, did this 13-week bridge, whatever you're calling it, did that time span work for the intended goal? Assuming that in this case, we'll say the intended goal is, I want to appear more muscular. So beyond just, did my pecs get bigger because I had this goal to make my pecs bigger? How do you go about assessing whether or not this a program worked, just from a general perspective, and then specifically in terms of like, what are the metrics other than maybe performance that you specifically track, that maybe other people can start to track if they want to be a little bit more specific about objective metrics where you can find them?
Yeah, so I personally use with myself and clients pictures, skin folds, circumference, um, depending on, where you're at, in the season, or, what goal you have at the time. It could be a little bit more spread out. So if you're really lean, you're going to do, say, skin folds more often. You're going to do pictures more often. Circumference is one of those things that's like a pretty long-term measure. It's never something, I'm doing like week to week. But you may get an idea, say like over a year, sometimes even more, when you look at multiple measures and you say, all right, like my skin folds overall, are the same, but, my arm measurement is bigger. And that would be an example where you could say, all right, I'm like, I don't appear fatter in the pictures. I don't appear fatter, like, on the skin folds. My waist circumference, is the same, but my arms are bigger. You could say pretty confidently in that case, if you know, are, have someone who's practiced at doing circumference, and you're doing them under the same conditions, and you get, multiple measurements, that your arms, grew in that instance. Now, what you don't know is like, did your biceps grow? Did your triceps grow? And certainly not like over the last, year and a half, what exactly, were the reasons for that. So it becomes really, really difficult to decipher exactly, what did what, especially, like I said, you're looking over very long time courses when you're trying to say, did this, specific muscle get better? It is nice when you have bodybuilders, because when you're looking at stage photos, that is a place where you can start to decipher, like, if you actually, changed a specific muscle group. But even then, like, just the peaking, even the entire diet, in terms of potentially, like, did you retain, or put on muscle? Like, did you lose, fullness? All of that can impact the look too, even how you pose. So I think in general, like, we really don't have tremendous ways of saying, like, on a small scale, whether something, improved or not. There sometimes are some pretty, like, vast differences that you can measure, say with a tape measure, or you can look at someone on stage and be like, ooh, that clearly got better. But I think largely things tend to just trend in the same direction over time, where it's like, most people's shape stays relatively the same. And a lot of what we're looking at is kind of just like, shape of muscle bellies, sort of where things are attaching, like limb lengths, things like that, that oftentimes give these sort of like silhouette of a person that we're analyzing.
Yeah, one of the things that you brought up initially was performance, and how this week you kind of observed a performance dip across most stuff, and how that sort of was aligning with your subjective appraisal of how you were feeling and whatnot. And the topic of performance is very interesting to me, because I think that, especially when I was first getting into all this stuff years ago, like progressive overload and the concept of progressive overload was like a huge thing. It still is a huge thing. And I think that people had looked at that a couple of different ways that maybe are a bit misleading. So number one would be like, progressive overload as a concept to me in some ways is just this response that necessitates more stimulus, right? So, if you on week one use 100 pounds and you do 10 reps, and that's like hard as fuck, and the next week you do 100 pounds again and you get more reps, and the next week you do 100 pounds again, you get more reps, maybe you eventually get to a point where you can do 18 or 20 reps with that same weight. And maybe we'll say in both cases, if you just effort equate, you're at failure the first week at 10 reps and you're at failure at the last week at 18 or 20. That is something, to me, that is an instance where, like, you eventually just get to a point where you're doing so many reps that it becomes impractical, right? So you add weight so that you stay in a lower rep range. So to me, it's like, progressive overload is like something that I personally look at as like it's kind of like an afterthought. Like, if I check in with this exercise, am I at a point where I feel like I need to add more weight to maintain the difficulty of the motion, rather than being this thing that is predictive of, if I do 100 pounds this week, then I'll be able to do 110 next week. When it's like, in reality, a lot of times I see people and 10% is a pretty big jump, but a lot of times I'll see people adding weight intentionally when it's not really necessary, or when maybe they could have just done 1 or 2 more reps. And this comes to the conversation of like progression schemes and progressions, just looking at them on a smaller scale, adding a rep to 3 different sets, adding 2 reps total, through a workout, those kinds of things. But where I'm going with this is kind of like, I think the concept of progressive overload has been equated with better outcomes. So we think like, more weight equals better, or, more progressive overload equals I gained more muscle. When in reality, like a lot of times I don't really see super jacked guys like lifting up, other than a few exceptions. I don't really see like really big bodybuilders lifting just exponentially greater amounts of load compared to like really strong natural people. Like on the extremes, it's like you take the bodybuilders that are 260, 270, 280, like those are sort of the mutants in one category. But everyone up to that point, it's kind of like, if I'm doing a biceps curl on a cable machine, it's not like the guy who weighs 280 a lot of times is doing like what proportionally looks like it would make sense. So the way I kind of am looking at it is almost like, you can get stronger and more muscular, but it's usually, to me, like you get stronger as a consequence of gaining more muscle. You don't gain more muscle by adding more load to something, if that makes sense. And so and when it comes to this conversation and how it relates to the whole did it work thing, I think a lot of people answer that question of did it work with did the visual appearance of my strength go up? And I think oftentimes those things are actually inversely correlated, where when people tend to really try to escalate load, the quality of the individual rep goes in the opposite direction, rather than just people sort of allowing more load to come to them when the quality sort of necessitates it, right? When I'm doing just an impractical amount of reps or something like that. So that's kind of just a separate-ish thought on like progressive overload and the concept of like, did this thing work? Because I think a lot of people equate those two things in their head, when to me they're just in separate categories, if that makes sense. Like to me, performance and tracking performance is almost like, as you were saying earlier, a good indication of whether or not things very generally are trending in a positive direction. But any single exercise or any single progression is not an indication of your physical progress, as in, are you getting more muscular? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I hear progressive overload, I never think of the word load as like weight on the bar.
Mm-hmm.
I think in a lot of contexts, maybe that is a confusion. I just think of progressive overload as progressive overstress, you
Yeah.
know, applying more stress, to your muscles. And, there's obviously a lot of ways you can achieve that, ranging from like the exercise that you choose, to the way that you set it up, to the way that you execute a rep, to the effort that you put in on the set, to the improving your reps, to doing more sets, to adding more load, to uh, hitting more muscle groups by by sort of creating more variety and more sort of variability in the program. So you're hitting things maybe that you weren't really training very well before. So there's a lot of ways to go about stressing specific tissues, or tissues that you haven't been stressing before. Like there's a lot of roads to roam there. Um, and when we talk about pharmacology, for example, like that's almost independent in some ways. Like it's definitely synergistic, but it even has an independent effect, and it even kind of changes like how that whole equation plays out. And then, the genetics will have an influence on top of that. And you can see that play out just in terms of like, how much effort does someone need to put in? Like, what does their training frequency look like? And then, as people get larger, that also affects those things. What kind of training frequency can they tolerate? So, for example, like, when I was talking to Mike the other day, I was telling him how, I've actually kind of settled back on more of a bro split-esque training frequency, because if I do 375 leg extension, and find me a leg extension that has 375 pounds on it. Like it doesn't exist much. You're pinning multiple plates on there typically. If I do that for, 18 reps instead of 20 reps, is it really creating like that much less stress, on my knees? Is it really creating that much less like, systemic fatigue? And same, pick your exercise. I just use that because we mentioned it earlier. But, just knocking a couple reps off, when you're getting into high absolute loads, like high absolute, just, magnitudes of stress, doesn't really change the margins that much. It's because there's other shit that needs to deal with that. In this case, I mentioned just like the orthopedic load. A couple reps does not dramatically influence that. So yeah, there's this separation of like weight on the bar versus load as a concept of stress. And I also think a lot of times when you're watching, the elite bodybuilders train, they're already at a point where they're not really gaining muscle. Like the majority of the guys that you're like watching on YouTube are already at a point where they're at maintenance. Like I was watching Nick Walker train while I was eating breakfast this morning, actually. And, he always says like, this is a podcast that people listen to, but I just talk to you like it's you and me. So I'll just be candid. Like he says he uses the RP app, but also like you have to record like your weights, sets, and reps, on an app like that. Like, so you go in and say like, I did, 375 on the leg extension, 15. Are you telling, and he's doing like multiple drop sets and shit. You're telling me like you just remember? I don't know. Maybe when he's not videoing it, like he uses the app, but then he videos it and like goes back afterwards and counts up. I doubt it. Like, I just don't, it's hard for me to see that he's like going back, remembering every single weight that he uses, plugs it into the app. A lot of times it's just kind of by feel. You can tell he's choosing the exercise, as he goes along, whereas, the app would have prescribed it. But also, I think for the most part, like, his explanations of his training don't make much sense, but like what he's doing actually looks really good. I think in practice, like it's all very sensible. The quality of what he's doing is really good. So it's very impressive compared to, maybe what you would have historically seen. But I've also noticed like in a lot of cases, it just goes way too far, where it's like, oh, we take this concept of like, accentuating this, that, or the other thing, accentuating the distance that it moves, and we call a range of motion, or accentuating, the like pause and the lengthened or what have you. And, or this, a lot of times bodybuilders end up doing like unilateral exercises for no reason that are just really unstable. So he was doing dumbbell lateral raises, but like one arm at a time. And it was like, maybe 20s or something. It's like, it's way harder than it looks. And like, I'm sure it feels really hard, but like the output's shit. And it's like curling with, super light weights and like squeezing the shit out of it. Like there was doing a front raise with a cable, and there was like 15 pounds on there. And I just think at a certain point, like he's going to be as muscular as he's been for the last 5 years. And that's not the thing that's determining whether he's successful or not. So I think objective, like, again, I think the explanation of a lot of the stuff like isn't always on point, but I think, and it's also hard as a competitor to really like wrap your mind around the idea of like, well, you're not really trying to like grow muscle. you're actually just trying to maintain, but like nobody ever says that.
Hmm.
But Jay Cutler will be like, "Wow, it was 270, in my, in season, pro season 3, it was 255 in pro season 10." And it's like, you didn't gain muscle, between those two things. Like other things changed, the other competitors changed, like your visual appearance based on, your waistline, how lean you were for one competition, the other, how much fluid retention you had, all those things changed, but you didn't gain muscle between those 2 points. And I think there's a ton of that. And I think, again, to, Nick's credit, like lowering the weight, just really focusing on controlled reps is probably an awesome idea compared to like what Ronnie and Dorian did, because, those guys at a certain point weren't getting any bigger either, and they could have been much better off, theoretically just recognizing that and maintaining in a way that was orthopedically sustainable. So much credit to Nick and the people in his camp doing that sort of thing. But I think as an athlete you may not sort of recognize that at the time, and you can sort of convince yourself like using the 20 pounds and like squeezing the shit out of it is like the way to go. But the reality is like you could be doing much less. Like in this case you are doing much less, but it's enough to maintain where you're at. And I think that's a lot of what you observe, in high level bodybuilders. But if you watch them in the 10 years before that, they went from, squatting 3 plates to squatting 7 plates. So I do think there was a period of like massive change in regards to the amount of like total stress, that they were putting their muscles under. And then at a certain point, it just, naturally plateaus, and they find, creative ways to still like maintain that stimulus. Or like in my case, I've went through seasons, I've went through a number of seasons where like I did find creative ways to train where the weight on the bar didn't look super heavy, but based on the exercise selection, setup, etc., I believe the stimulus was still very high.
Something I'm super interested in as a concept that is related to that is because, I've always wondered, like, how do massive guys stay massive without lifting massive shit? Like, that's really the question, or the what you're bringing up there. And I think a lot of it, obviously, nutrition, pharmacology, those kinds of things, genetics, whatever. But I think that an under talked about variable here, or an under discussed variable, is like efficiency of contraction. And this is something that I've seen in terms of a disparity between you and I, where there will be, and obviously there are other factors here, like a ton of other factors, but I've seen in a lot of cases, even on an exercise that doesn't have a particularly favorable resistance profile, like you're able to basically get through that range not only like a little bit more smoothly than most people I've seen, but also just in a way where you finish the last rep and it's like you don't have an inch of the next one. Whereas even if like, you have a perfect profile on person XYZ, a lot of times there are a lot of like messy partials, or at least just partials that are, still controlled, like in my case. And I think that, again, there are also factors to discuss, like in terms of how muscle bellies change and how pennation angle can change and how that results in a different direction of pull on bones, etc. But I think a lot of it ultimately is related to the fact that you just get really good at using like your muscles. And so I wonder how much of a factor that could end up being in terms of being able to keep intramuscular forces high while external loads are not as high. I would assume that would have some role somewhere in terms of people being able to maintain tissue at lower loads, or lower loads than you would expect. Obviously, maintaining something is easier than building it, right? So that may be another factor, generally speaking. But that's a very interesting conversation that I don't see, come up, because we talk about it very generally, like, oh, these people are more advanced, and we talk about it from a skill perspective. But a lot of people that are hypermuscular don't appear very skilled in the motions that they're doing and how they're controlling them. Nick is a great example. I think pretty much all of the training that I've seen him do, which is admittedly is not very much, has been like super controlled. I've seen him talk about how like he was dumbbell pressing like the 150s, like super controlled, like 20 reps or whatever. And he was like, if you're lifting more than 100 pounds, and you're tossing it around, like, you got no business doing that. So I think it's cool to see those kinds of people who are relaying those kinds of messages in a spotlight. Someone like Hunter Labrada is in like a really good camp in terms of like how dialed in he is with execution. He's someone who preaches, tracking stuff. And so I think that like overall, I think the bodybuilding space can certainly be moved more in that direction with those kinds of guys. And I definitely have seen that in people who are, higher level. Because I know there's a lot of people in my audience specifically who are actually fairly high level and who like the information that I put out, which is not, a couple of years ago, something that I would have expected to be just a reality. So I think it's cool to kind of see that trend happening kind of in front of us, over time. Do you have anything to say on that? Okay. The last thing that I wanted to bring up, just in terms of like something that can relate to this discussion as a whole, is just this idea of trade-offs, because it's something that I think about now at maybe almost to my detriment at literally like every turn. What are the upsides? Like, what is the problem that I'm dealing with? What is the solution? What is the potential solution? And then what are the trade-offs of the various solutions? And how do they relate to one another? Which cat is this?
It's Faith.
Okay. Is that where you're? Yeah. For anyone watching, you can see Ethan's cat, who has one eyeball. Or like 1.2 eyeballs, maybe. But yeah, this concept of trade-offs and nothing really being perfect, I think, is a really good, maybe not good, but a really important framework to have in mind at all turns. Because, with this conversation, again, tying it back to like, did this exercise work? It's like this exercise, the way the better framework I think to have, because I would want to, provide something concrete and alternative here, is not to look at something as it in isolation, really in any instance, but rather it in terms of the things that you could be doing at the same time. So if you're doing a dumbbell curl, what are the qualities of a dumbbell curl that maybe a cable curl doesn't have, or vice versa? And what potentially are the trade-offs between those two in terms of how they relate to the rest of your program? Like those kinds of questions to me, in terms of like just the relationship to other things, and the relationship of the qualities, the upsides and the downsides, however you look at that to me is the more appropriate framework. So rather than asking like, how do you know that this thing worked? It's more just like, what does this thing provide that these other things don't? Or what is this thing missing that these other things have? And that's, I think, a better way to create messaging as well, just on a bigger scale. It's just like, here's the information, and use whichever information seems more contextually appropriate to the problem that you're trying to solve. I was listening to this. He's actually a divorce lawyer. His name is James Sexton. He's done a lot of pretty big podcasts recently. Like, if you've heard of Lex Friedman, he just was on a Lex episode. And he's been on a few other big podcasts, and he's really charismatic, like super good speaker. I would highly recommend. I think anyone would enjoy listening to him. He talks a lot about relationships, and he talks a lot about the concept of trade-offs. And how the expectation or the idea of like the soulmate has in many ways been to the detriment of like long-term marital success, because people come into the marriage or the relationship with the expectation or the feeling of like, this person is my soulmate and they will have everything that I need and they can provide all of these things, rather than looking at the relationship as like, here are the things, here are the qualities in this person that complement mine, and then here are the places or the situations in which we're going to butt heads. And both of those you can actually look at as positive depending on the framing, because a lot of times, like my differences in relationship to Audrey, who for those of you who don't know is my fiance, the differences that she brings into my life, I used to look at as challenges and like things that were holding us back, but I now look at as like these things that I can actually use in a different way that are complementary. So I think much in the same way, like you have a kind of relationship with every single exercise that you do, and you have a relationship with every pathway from a nutritional perspective or a program perspective that you can go down. And there will always be a framing of, there will always be a scenario in which there are upsides to, taking this path, and there are downsides, and you just have to measure that against things that you could also be doing at the same time. So again, rather than just looking at any of these things individually, it's important to look at it as important to look at them as relationships to other similar things, because I think any time in any instance that you over focus or you hone in too much on any one thing or variable, you tend to lose what we generally refer to as the bigger picture. But I really think it's just that you lose the ability to make the best decision based on the problem, because what that necessitates, that whole process, is that you actually lose the context of the problem. So if you're looking at, a single thing in isolation and you look at how good is this thing, unless you're looking at it in relationship to a problem that you're solving, you've lost the purpose of that, having that thing in place in the first place. So yeah, that was the only thing that was on my mind other than what we've already discussed. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on there or in general?
No, nothing's coming to mind, Ben.
All right, cool. I suppose one other thing that I wanted to ask you to wrap this up is, you mentioned kind of where you're headed in terms of like the fatigue stuff, and you laid out the timeline that you're under, which by the way, I think, and I forgot to mention, very few people have the interest to lay out that kind of timeline. And I think it can be useful to lay out a timeline if you're someone who functions well kind of starting at the end and working backward. I don't think it's necessary for a lot of people, but I think it's very good, at least initially, if you're someone who's not very structured. Like when you and I started training together, like you had this idea of like, okay, we have this 16-week block, so you would tell me the very specific date in, however 6 months from now that like this block is going to end. That was very helpful to me. And I had never done a program that was that long. So just as a caveat, I think that's a helpful tidbit to take away from that. But in terms of where you're headed, let's say this week and the following week, you had this perception of, okay, this past week performance maybe has taken a dip, fatigue is maybe higher. What exactly, in terms of the concrete things in relationship to that, can you talk about in terms of this upcoming week? Like, how are things going to change broadly? And, how long will that change timeline last?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, like this previous block was 13 weeks. Generally for me, like an off-season course, mesocycle block, whatever you want to call it, lasts somewhere between 12 and 20 weeks. And to some degree, that's, auto-regulated in the sense that we have something down on paper, and then, we don't know exactly, when things are going to sort of, plateau or start to decline. But obviously that's when you're going to, make the transition. But in this case, when you have a timeline, like I know at certain points, like, all right, I need to kind of back off at this point to allow enough space for this upcoming thing. Again, if I'm working backwards from a competition, like I know that I have to start dieting, at this point based on previous experience at these, skin folds, etc. So it's helpful to have that like line in the sand, and then I can work backwards. And that's how we came to this idea of, all right, this is going to be about a 13-week block. And, it is interesting that, topic of like, sort of a mental anchoring that we've given before. If you lay yourself out a timeline and a finish line, is there some sort of like psychological anchoring that happens where you just fatigue yourself in that amount of time? Either because you kind of like speed up towards the end, or you have an expectation of that's where you should finish. And I do think at some point, like there's going to be more attention paid to the psychological, the framing, the like environmental factors that influence, the perception of fatigue, rather than just looking at it through this like exercise physiology lens, because it's probably a very, very limited way to look at like, how long should a training block be, and what sort of what sort of things can we influence like in the weight room to adjust that. When you look at like different training environments, say like Metroflex, where Ronnie and Branch trained, I think about how we talk about, for example, just like the fatigue that could come along with a lot of like excitation, before a set. But there are also people that, appear to have done that throughout their entire career, and, were able to do that day after day, week after week, and be very successful, with that method. That doesn't mean that, other things couldn't have been, more sustainable, or that they could have, done more under different contexts. But you see that the environment can really shape the perception of, what's possible. If the thought is, all right, we only take a break, in the month after the contest, and the rest of the year we push it, 6 days a week, there are going to be physiological limits and things will break. But I think it will also have a very strong influence on what your perception of possible is. And I think if you just frame it as, a person can only survive, on average about 4 weeks of hard training, I think you potentially run into, a real framing issue there, where that may influence the perception of what's possible and what's fatiguing. And you definitely see this when you put people like in a team environment, even, two training partners together. I've seen very consistently over the years just tend to fatigue around the same point, even with drastically different lifestyles, nutritional interventions, drugs. So the two people seem to kind of like sync up, even though the rest of their lives are entirely different. So I think there are probably a lot of unseen variables that really, really have a big influence on, what we see in the realm of like progression. And, sometimes we sort of poo-poo, maybe on the, bodybuilders that, don't really have a plan and just come in and wing it. And, they may say things like, I don't deload, and, I just, go hard all the time, brother, kind of thing. And then when you actually like observe what they're doing in practice, like all of those components are still there. Like there are times when, they go a little bit lighter. Like I mentioned, in this upcoming block, like I'm going to do some drop sets. And people will say, well, that's an intensifier. Like that's higher intensity. Like that's, that's tougher. But to me, it's just a way of using less load and getting out of the gym faster.
Mm.
You know, for one person, that's what you do to like, like finish the end of a block and like, just take yourself to the edge of the cliff and get every last bit out of it you can. I see no reason why that can't be used. Like the thing for me again is I don't want to be in the gym for like 2+ hours when I'm in a period, of like where the goal is to reduce, overall stress, right? Like I want to decrease the number of days I'm in the gym. I want to decrease the hours, I'm there for. That'll give me more time, to spend with, my wife and my pets and my friends and sleep more. And, then after, 4 to 6 weeks of doing that, I'll want to go back to, 2, 3 hour workouts, 5 days, in the gym, like Saturday nights, working all day and then, training and getting home at, 8, 9 o'clock at night. But eventually, like, that shit gets fatiguing, right? So anyway, like this upcoming block is, in the like enhanced realm, what we call like a bridge phase, which the bridge connects two courses. As Broderick Chavez always kind of like slaps people on the wrist for calling a drug block like a cycle, because cycles come back to the start, but courses have a destination.
Hmm.
Set a very specific destination, and we call that mesocycle or block when drugs are taken a course. And a course, like I said, is connected by a bridge, and a bridge would typically just be considered like a deload or a maintenance, period in like the unenhanced realm. So again, we line up multiple factors: the training, nutritional, pharmacological, and even in mental and environmental realms. And we say, all right, we're going to have some of these things online for a period. We're going to call that a course. The goal of this course, is XYZ. And then we're going to have to reduce, usually multiple of those variables. And we have a bridge where the goal is to recover, at least some of those systems between courses. So, like on my walk today, as I often take the dog out in the woods before our calls, I made a little note, and at the top I put, bodybuilding fatigue. And I said, I made one column called remove. And these are things like, basically, all right, this is what I'm feeling right now in terms of like, this is things that I would like to eliminate, or things that I would like to add that would give me the perception of reducing fatigue. Because that's a lot of what this is. Again, it's just perception. Like yesterday, I was helping someone design like an off-season diet. And I said, just start the off-season diet with, what would you eat if you could eat anything? And then we'll work backwards from there. So the person has very little appetite in the morning, very high appetite at night. They really like, if their perfect morning is like, a bagel, that's, we start there, right? And then what happens is, there are some things that are absolutes. It's like, all right, I still need you to have this amount of protein. Like, I still need you to have some, fruits and vegetables, etc. I still need you, to eat, 4+ times a day. And once we start building in those constraints, after starting with like, what would you like to do? I think that's kind of like the perfect convergence. So when I think, what would I like to do to reduce fatigue? Like I said, I feel very fatigued. I feel the buildup of fatigue when I have like no time on the weekends to really rest, where it's like I get home late Saturday night, I sleep in on Sunday, but then Sunday I'm like preparing for the week, and it just feels like the week's restart. But if I have a weekend off of training, that's very restorative to me. So the thing that I put at the top of the list under fatigue was Saturday training. On Saturdays recently, I've been training arms, so I'll just take that same volume and I'll plug it into 2 different sessions. I think what I'll do is I'll put the bicep training in with my push day, and I'll put the tricep training in with my hamstrings and caps day. So boom, down to 4 days. And those days aren't going to be any longer, because like I mentioned before, I'll be doing the drop sets, which will bring the training time down significantly, because it reduces, the rest time in between the sets primarily. And also just like the setup, like putting the seatbelt on, grabbing the banana handles, all that kind of shit.
So that means that this upcoming Saturday that we're not training.
Yeah, I got to think about what to do about that, because I was expecting to go one more week,
which is fine. We could go bowling or something.
Yeah, I don't know. I gotta think about how to set that up because I still want to do that. Like I may just move, Friday to Saturday or something like that. But I'm gonna talk to one of my coaches today or tomorrow, and it'll mostly be, my decision, but just figure out how I want to set up this upcoming week. I'm always tempted personally, like my natural inclination is to just like find the absolute edge of it. Like my inclination is let's do one more week and see if I can't like find a way to like, eke it out. If I just take a little bit more of this and like change this, is there like another inch that I can get? And like everything about my experience and like my rational brain is like that makes no sense. It's way smarter now just to pull back and have an extra week later than it is to do an extra week now. But my intellectual curiosity is very much like, well, can we test a hypothesis? Like, I really like to just know, well, if I change this thing, what's going to happen? And like, is this actually driven by this, or is it really just a consequence of that? So I do just naturally like to find the edges so that I can, have a more firm understanding or at least hypothesis on like what's driving what. Um, but yeah, so that's like a good example of something that, is very specific to me and my schedule. And it's not just like something you could apply to everyone, where it's like, I perceive that as fatiguing, and it's very easy to move that, to another day. Um, you know, again, when I'm training multiple hours in the gym and I'm driving separate gyms to do it at, like they're long nights, I get home late, I might not sleep as long as I normally would. If I can shorten those sessions, I can do all of that and still achieve, a lower training load. Um, and then, I also go through some just like subjective symptoms of kind of the things that might happen to me in this case, which is again, I'll, get more brain fog. Like it's harder for me to do things like, podcasts and whatnot and just have good recall and good flow conversationally. I'll become like, more irritable. It takes me longer to get up for training. Just kind of like, I find maybe normally it would take me like, an hour to prep everything, to get ready to train. And now it could be an hour and a half plus, and that just kind of extends and extends. And I find myself doing little things. So then that just makes the day longer. You go to sleep later, right? And then just everything just kind of gets like drawn out further and further. Um, so, sometimes those are even good opportunities. Like, you know, you're not going to fix every one of these things. Like you're not going to be able to create an environment where you're just like so mentally in check that you never get irritable. Um, but it is a good opportunity to sort of like investigate which situations, might create that. Like what are some better ways, to handle yourself in those situations. It's a really good opportunity to just like inspect um, how you can either adopt an environment or adopt strategies within that environment where you can become a better person in more ways than just through your physique. So when you're under stress like that and you can examine those areas, you're like, oh, you know what, next time maybe I could approach it in this way. And if you practice repeatedly, eventually you do get better at handling those situations where maybe the first time you would have just like overreacted to something that you thought was very real in the moment, but you start to realize later on like, oh, I just kind of feel this way because I'm tired, and you can start to pick it up before it actually happens in real time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something that I think is needs to be first intentionally brought to people's awareness, because I think that in the context of training, we tend to look at it as like separate from the rest of our lives. Like here's this little vacuum of training stress that only applies in and of itself. And I think that that model of just zooming out a little bit to view it in the context of everything else going on, that is a really big paradigm shift that I had initially when training with you, was just the consideration of everything else that had nothing to do with the X's and O's on paper of like how many sets and reps we're doing. Like it's a lot more than something like fatigue is a lot more than just sets and reps and how much weight am I lifting. And I didn't really realize even just how related the training fatigue and normal life stresses were. And I think to some degree, of course, like as we discussed, you can sort of anchor yourself into feeling more fatigued when maybe it's like you wouldn't have experienced a dip in performance if you hadn't been so aware of it. Like if you know that you see this with like people who wear like whoops and aura rings a lot, as they'll talk about their sleep score. Like, oh, my whoop said I was this percent under recovered, and so I can expect not as good a performance. So they'll say things that are like predictive in that way. So I think, as always, there's a trade-off to that degree of awareness, but I think it's a much more of a net positive than a net negative for sure. That degree of awareness, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I was starting to see that trend, before like before I started to, speak it out loud. And then I tried to find ways, to take myself out of that bias. As you know, I don't know how many reps I did the week before. I just, do the set and then reflect on it after the case, after the fact. But this week also I played around with like looking at how many reps I did last time and then just using like loud music and higher levels, again, of excitation to try to, achieve that. And, when it's like the last week or two, it's not, as big of a deal. And, still wasn't really able to pull that, those numbers out. Um, so yeah, like I said, it's interesting for me. I always have fun kind of experimenting and seeing like what moves the needle. I think it's interesting too, again, from like looking at the other factors as far as like nutrition, pharmacology. At a certain point, like nothing else really moves the needle. It's like you could eat all the food in the world, take all the drugs in the world, and like there is a separation at a certain point where it's just like you can't fix one problem with like a solution in a separate vector. When you're, a few weeks out from a competition, like no amount of drugs is going to make you get more muscular. Like you need that food to be in play to some degree, and the same thing, like once you've incurred a certain level, of fatigue, through training, you can't just overwhelm that, with more food or more drugs. Like you do need rest that's very specific to the system that, you're trying to recover. And I did mention, at the beginning, like I was very proud that, didn't have any orthopedic symptoms, despite these other symptoms. And also like the other thing that would show up, when I was younger is I would just get that fatigue of like, oh, getting up for the set of like, all right, I gotta like lift this heavy weight. And again, that, I always say that word excitation, but just like getting jacked up for the set. That would be another thing where by the end of the block, I would just be like, oh my God, like I gotta, do XYZ exercise. Like, and it would just take a lot to pull that, emotion out of myself to be able to achieve that set. And that type of psychological or emotional burnout, I don't really experience that at this point either. Whereas I mentioned, maybe the fatigue is more just like, hours in the gym, length of the day, type of stuff, but not so much like an individual set type of deal.
Yeah, I experienced that on a life slash work level in terms of the concept of fatigue and trying to throw more shit at the fan to solve the problem. Where if I'm ever going through a period of like life stress that is higher, I usually try to fill my time with more work, and like more reading and more learning, and how can I make this presentation better, and how can I make this post better, and all, like, that's where all of my thinking goes toward, rather than just, usually what I need is just to sit down and just like stare at the wall and just like let the dust settle, look at my cat or something.
Yeah.
um
It ended up being a big thing with like my back recovery, where one of the most potent things for me, just based on the way I go about my life and my training, is that just more nothing for me was one of the most potent recovery stimuli that I could have, is just kind of lay around and do less.
yeah,
uh, and as much impact probably as anything else was just not training and just laying around.
who would have thought?
Yeah, but I don't think, again, like I don't think that's always the case for people. Like a lot of people, most
Yeah,
people probably even listening to this, like, will not be in a position where their training stresses affect their life to a significant degree. I don't come across many people in the gym who experience that as a reality. And a lot of that is that kind of like planning where you're systematically increasing stress, to a peak. When you do that, you experience, that peak or that cliff. But otherwise, you sort of you unconsciously auto regulate your fatigue to a very smooth, um, just kind of like constant level. And you don't realize it. It's kind of like, NEAT in fat loss, NEAT being non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which just means like the amount of activity you're doing subconsciously, basically, like just fidgeting, moving around. You're just burning calories by moving more. And that, will happen sometimes as you eat more food, and that'll sometimes decrease as you eat less food. Um, And when you're not tracking things and you're not purposely setting timelines, you're not purposely, progressively overloading something, eating more, doing more with training. Again, the ways that you do that can be very nuanced. But if you're not very intentionally trying to move the needle, once you get past kind of like, we'll say an intermediate level, you're going to just revert back to the mean. And that's what happens most of the time. So, as an example, like I purposely utilized that phenomenon in this course that I just went through, because my goal again was to maintain my body weight and, gain some muscle, lose some fat, some recom. But I didn't want to get much heavier because I knew historically that would be problematic based on the trends that I had seen, or at least, that was my hypothesis. Um, so a lot of this phase, like, I have my daily diet, and it's much more practical to more or less eat the same thing every day. But especially towards the end of this block, I would say pretty much every day at this point, again, like definitely in the last 2 to 3 weeks after my training, I just allow myself to go like hypoglycemic to the point where I'm like just sweaty and starving. And I just eat all the carbs. Like, Annie and I, my wife and I, after we get done training, we go out to all you can eat sushi. Last night, me and Neve got dinner, actually.
wow.
People in the gym. Found a new Korean barbecue place, like just walking distance from the gym.
How was it?
It was definitely subpar, but it was $30. It's like a short walk from the gym. So it's like totally doable. It wasn't as good as Let's Meet, but I've been doing that basically after every training session, just like eating as much carbs as I feel like. And I mean, for perspective, that's usually like 400-ish grams. Um, and my weight's exactly the same.
Mhm.
Because even though like my perception is, oh my God, I'm like stuffing myself and like I'm eating as much as I can possibly eat in this setting, or in this that's what a lot of people do. It's like, oh, I'm crushing it, bro. This workout was like the hardest thing I've ever done. I'm limping afterwards. I finished with, walking lunges or push-ups, or body weight, this, that, or the other thing, 10-pound goblet squats at the end of my workout. So you come every day and you just do things subjectively. Like, I ate as much as I could possibly eat. There's no way I could have eaten any more. There's no way I could have trained any harder. But you didn't measure like the entirety of things, and you didn't progressively like set a timeline and a plan. Your body will find a way, to bring other things down and bring you into balance very often. So that's where that timeline, the plan, and having a real intention to do more than you did before really comes into play. Like, I'm not saying, my metabolism just like, regulated in a way where I just burn, more calories. I'm saying there's probably other meals where, I eat a little bit less. I'm probably moving way more. Like, my general diet is probably hypocaloric, and then those meals bring me right up to an isocaloric level. But the amount I eat in those meals is entirely subjective. So it's probably, over the week just gets me right back to that level. But I know that, like, I'm doing that on purpose because I know to maintain my weight doesn't take planning like that. Like, again, I have a very baseline diet. It's going to be much more structured than, just about anybody. But I can, if I ever want to eat a meal out, I have some constraints on like the type of foods I'll eat, just like the type of exercises we'll use. I tend to be on a higher carbohydrate, lower fat diet. So I have some constraints within there, but I know within that, like, if I want to keep things, at a, at sort of like a homeostatic or baseline level, there's so much wiggle room in there if you just let your subjectivity take over.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like the final lesson for today is, typically that's not the way to go about things, but it is fun to utilize that if that's the goal at the moment, and you're someone who has enough experience and enough baseline structure built in.
Yeah, and that's interestingly kind of naturally where I've ended up across a week, where you pointed out to me that I probably naturally and intentionally, well, no, I intentionally eat bigger meals on weekends, like Fridays, Saturdays, or Sundays, and I naturally kind of just eat less during the week. And that is something that just kind of happened over time, where I didn't really need to be intentional about eating less during the week. It's just like I just didn't even really want and I've been the same weight now for a good amount of time, probably over a month, just like hovering around this body weight. Maybe I've lost a few pounds, but it's interesting to see how that works out on in other areas as well. Yeah, and it's cool to also see, this is the last thing, but to see how that kind of the fatigue discussion plays out in the context of something like blood work, which you and I have talked about in the past, and we've seen, haven't talked about blood work that much. Maybe it's a topic for another time, but for some reason I was very surprised to be made aware of the concept of, like, if you are generally training harder and you're fatigued more often, then your blood test results will often come back as, like, for example, like your test might be lower than it would be if you weren't fatigued at all. That, like, that kind of marker was for some reason completely surprising to me, like, because intuitively, like, you might expect the opposite, where if you're like this big macho guy and you lift in weights often, you train super hard, you would expect to be like high T guy. But yeah, that concept of the sort of a balancing act that the system creates, that is also occurring at a more we'll say chemical level as well, not just in terms of behaviorally, but in terms of how things are balancing inside of you. You not so surprisingly, you use more energy, you do more stuff, you use more resource, and you use more of your stuff to kind of provide for that.
Yeah, and you pay for it, you know, like
Yeah.
it costs something to do that. And you can use it in a way where if you're looking at someone's blood work and they say they're doing XYZ, you should expect to see the consequences of that in some way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if someone's not familiar with any of like the fatigue symptoms that I've talked about a little bit, like chances are you just really haven't pushed that hard. The same thing, like if you look at someone's blood work and it was just like perfect all the time, and they say that they're pushing training really hard. Again, it depends what you're looking at, but like chances are, like if you're building a lot of muscle and you're driving a lot of fatigue, and this could be an endurance athlete, or it could be a strength athlete, like there are certain markers that you're going to expect to see thrown off, and if you don't, like in a lot of ways it should be a surprise. It's not always a good thing.
Yeah, makes sense.